All right. So with that, let's interact. We're going to get into it now. And I will be actually passing it off to Miggy to give us a little bit of an intro into interactive components.
All right, let's get started. Let me take a moment here to share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen there? Just get a thumbs up if we're all good. Okay, so thinking about interactive components. Before interactive components, if any of you have prototyped in Figma before, trying to create kind of like smaller interactions could be a bit of a pain in the butt. If you look here, if you wanted to create something like a simple list and check things off, you would have to create many, many, many frames to kind of like accomplish the complexity of demonstrating that. So now with interactive components, things are much simpler. We can kind of componentize that. We can make these smaller, sort of shareable, reusable elements that will make prototyping much more accessible, much more fun, quicker, and have the opportunity to like iterate a little bit more. So I'm actually just going to pass it off to Nico real quick. Did you have any kind of like thoughts when you were building out the feature that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think one of the core things that we kind of like knew from the start, we had a first version of this kind of like, I don't know, 2.5 years ago during a Maker Week. So it's been a while, like it's been on our minds for quite some time. And one of the core things that hasn't changed since then was that we wanted to kind of like minimize the interaction concepts for that a larger prototype, right? You connect two frames with each other, that exactly that same interaction concept is also the concept we apply on the kind of like the smallest scale. So that if you hook up a hover state for a button, or if you hook up a kind of like a switch toggle, that's ultimately at the core the same behavior as building a larger prototype, because they're kind of the same thing. Jamie, you have a thought?
Yeah, so in building the feature, we obviously had to keep in mind some really core use cases. We had to keep in mind simple form controls like checkboxes and buttons. But through thinking through the mental model to try to really think deeply about the primitives that we wanted to build, and then this is kind of the thing that Nico's talking about, where we have very simple interaction paradigm here. People can use the same tools to create those simple constructs to build much, much more complicated things. So we kind of viewed the need for those things as constraints for the design rather than the goal of the design. It wasn't just that if we had accomplished hover states and checkboxes, then we could say like, okay, we've done it, like we've created the thing people need. We wanted to build something much, much richer while still providing just these really simple primitives that compose really well with the rest of the system. And it's been really, really cool to see that the system we built to support hover states has created these incredible examples that we've seen in the community.
Yeah, so I'm actually gonna, thanks for that, really appreciate it. Lovely, love that insight. So I'm gonna look at this image real quick, and to help people better understand where we're thinking about with interactive components. So in the past, if you had prototypes, you would go frame to frame to kind of like accomplish something as simple as, tapping back and forth. And then we introduced variants, and variants provided this opportunity to have kind of these multiple states, of any given component, thinking of that as like a component set. Now, interactive components kind of brings that together and makes it much more modular. So I'm going to hop right over into some examples that I have here. So this is kind of like based off of what I just showed, where we have the button. So if I hover, go into here, you see while hovering, the interactions are happening kind of like within that, between those variants. So if I go ahead and hit a preview, let's see, it's gonna refresh that. So now when I click, right, we're still in one single frame, and I'm able to get these nice micro interactions, and they're kind of remembering, the different kind of state that they're at. So I'm going to hop back over here. Let's take a look for like menus and tooltips. This is another great example. So here you can actually see we have these sort of nested items. So the way that this is built out, you can see that we have the hover state and we have these other options. So let's go ahead and play that. Let me just give it a hard refresh to make sure that that's working properly. And now, so we can see I can select a topping, I can kind of move up and down, and over here I have the tooltip. One thing that I do want to mention is that, these things, they're kind of like persisting across the frame. So like all of the objects, in order to have those elements kind of override, the elements kind of are existing in both of those states. But we'll get in more to that a little bit later. This is another example I really enjoyed putting together. This is a carousel, and this carousel, I have two different sort of iterations of it. So I have both of those placed on the stage here. So when I go ahead and hit play, let's see that prototype load up. And what I can do is I can drag, and because of the way that you can add multiple interactions onto the same object, when I'm here, I can drag both left and right, and it'll perform that kind of behavior. And like I said, that these are kind of sort of nested in within each other. So this kind of logic with the previous way that prototypes are handled would have been much, much more laborious to accomplish. Let's take a look at my favorite example, the tic-tac-toe. Here, once again, you can kind of see how this is easily beginning to play out, where we have these different states, where I have a hover state that then brings me two different options. I go one way or the other. Let's go ahead and hit play so y'all can kind of see how this actually works out. Let's refresh that prototype. So now I hover over, right? And all of those are just same instances of the same thing. So I can play a little version of tic-tac-toe with myself because I have nobody else to play with, sad face. But you know, this is kind of fun, and I can even reset each one of those individual objects. One really cool thing about that, and we're just gonna talk a little bit about iteration here. I can basically take that whole setup, I can duplicate it over here. And if I wanna change, you know, one of those properties, I'm going to just change that fill over to red. It's actually updating here. So one great thing about interactive components, it provides you this opportunity to really iterate on your designs, right? So if you're thinking about like, yeah, this is going to be great for my design system, it's also going to be great for your ability to just think through concepts, test things out, and iterate those. I'm going to hop over into experiments. So this is one of the first things, you know, that I thought of. Let's go ahead and hit play. And basically, what's happening here is that we are using auto delay to kind of like play through these interactions. So I hover over this object, right? And while I'm hovering, it's playing through that auto delay sequence of frames within the interactive component. So as I go through and hover over all of them, I'm able to have a much more sort of dynamic generative kind of prototype. It's a lot of fun. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Anthony, who's going to talk a little bit more about how these things are created.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Miggy, for going through that. Yeah. So quick tour of just the kinds of things that we can do. Let's go a little bit slower now, and we're going to back up, and we're actually going to build these things and really make sure that we understand how we actually put them together and some of the cool tips and tricks that you can use as you're building your own components. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And again, quick confirmation that we can see it. If I can just get a thumbs up. Awesome. Looks great. Fantastic. Oh boy, all of those thumbs up come through on notifications. Awesome. Very cool. So we are going to start with the basics. We're just going to start with a very simple button and work up from there. Now, as we mentioned in the beginning, interactive components is actually building on something that we launched last year, which was variants, right? Variants is the idea that we used to associate two things together simply through naming conventions, right? We would say something like button /default /hover, right? And those naming conventions themselves were how we associated that these were two states of the same button. That works, but it's a little fragile. And, you know, we would be doing things like swapping instances from the instance menu to make sure that we had the right one. But then we launched variants, and variants lets us take that same thing, but actually have it be a real construct within Figma where you have a single component that has multiple properties, and each of those properties can have multiple values. So we are going to be starting with variants for building interactivity. If you're brand new to variants, I definitely recommend checking out the variants live stream that we did last year as well. It'll walk through the basics to understand sort of how you can use variants. And this is going to be building on that concept by adding in interactivity. So for starters, we've got our simple button here, our two states. I'm going to combine these into a single component that has both of those as variants. So I hit the combine as variants button. You see we have a property called default and hover. Well, I know that this is a state, so I'm going to call this state. Here we go. I now have a button that, if I grab an instance of this and I bring this over to my canvas here, I have a button that I can switch its states, right? This is the power of what we were doing with variants. But now we want to set it up so that when I hover over that button, it'll always show me the hover property and value that I have here as well. So, or the hover variant. So what I'm going to do is going to go back to my component right here. And I'm going to switch to prototyping mode, just as the same as if I was going to be making a prototype where I was navigating between frames, except now we're going to be doing it from variant to variant. So you'll see here, Just like with prototyping, you're going to have the little handle, the noodles that you can pull out, and I'll connect the two together. Now, because we're using variants, it's going to understand automatically that I want to use our new behavior that's called change to. So you're going to see this new action here, this new interaction called change to, which change to basically means I want to move from one variant to another. You're only going to see this this action type or interaction type inside of variants. So that's how you'll know if you're in the right space. If you don't see it there, first of all, you have to be in the beta for right now, but beyond that, just make sure that you're actually working with variants as you're going through it. So here, you'll see that we have an on-click event. Well, in this case, it's a hover state that I want to use. So I'm actually going to change this to while hovering. So you can see now we've encapsulated this behavior inside of the variant, meaning that every time I go to use that component, if I have multiple instances of it, and let's go ahead and just play this so we can actually see it here. You can see now, as I just hover over these interactions, you get that included as part of your component, and you don't need to wire it up for every single version that you want to make. Some of you may have had a situation where you had some nice complex interactions and you had to move them to their own page so that you could actually prototype it and see it. You don't have to do that anymore. You can now just save those as a variant and you'll be able to, save those as an interactive component. And then anytime you go to use that component, you'll have those behaviors. So what's great is you'll see that in my assets panel now, if I go to the right page here, which I believe is going to be this create and use page here that we're on, you'll see that every time I go to grab an instance of this component, I'm going to have all of that behavior built in automatically. And again, this is a very simple example, but you're going to see how we build on this and can do some pretty crazy stuff. So again, sort of looking at what Miggy was showing off there, this is a lot of the same stuff that's happening over here with these behaviors, right? So we now have on-click events that are changing to different toggle states. Much of the same behaviors that you were able to do with prototyping, you can do here as well. So we have things like smart animations where we're actually smart animating between two of our variants. We're going to show some really cool examples for that in a little bit. But this is, again, if it feels like it's clicking or like it's making sense, we're taking two concepts that we had in the system and really just trying to bring them together and make this experience better for everyone. So let's up this a little bit and talk about a couple more things that we can do with interactive components. So next we want to talk about nesting interactive components. And yes, you can nest them. So this is an important thing to understand. Interactive components are still components, right? So a component can have variants, it can be interactive, it can be anything like that, which means that a lot of the things that you'd expect to work for a component are going to continue to work for interactive components too, meaning that you can nest them inside of other components. In this example here, you can see that we have a simple label that is a checkbox with a label. So when I click on it, it's basically going to say on click, change to this one, and then on click, change back. So I've built a little toggle here, right, where I can toggle between the two. I've actually nested that inside of a list component, right? So I actually have several instances of that nested component nested inside of a list because you may want to reuse elements like list elements, right? If you've got a list of menu options or you have a list of, in this case, checkbox forms or something like that, I've actually put them inside of a component here. And then I actually then use an instance of that somewhere else. So we basically have an instance of our menu list with instances of our interactive component inside of it, and things will continue to work as you expect. So if we play this one here, you'll be able to see that we are actually able to just continue to use those checkboxes. So again, many of the things that you might be familiar with and how you sort of build your scalable design, like using instances, nesting instances, things like that, you should continue to use those principles alongside of interactive components. Very similar to how variants, you still use things like instance swapping for nested instances and whatnot. You can continue to use those principles alongside of interactive components as well. Yeah, we definitely see a couple things coming in from the chat. Yes, it's full of layers. There's definitely a little bit of instance inception happening here too, which probably a good thing to mention too as well, right? Which is just that as with everything that we do in Figma, these are incredibly powerful tools, and you want to make sure that you're doing it at levels that are going to be understandable, not only to someone else, but you also a few months later too, right? So make sure that you're being careful. I mean, try everything, but then when you go to build things for production, obviously make some good decisions around how things are constructed so that they're easy for people to understand as you're designing as well. Don't forget to be responsible. Exactly. Clever is not always better, but sometimes, Great. Next thing that we want to look at is working with overrides, right? So again, as I mentioned, these are normal components, so they're going to work like components as you'd expect. In fact, some of the properties of variants are going to feel very natural because they're going to basically build on the same concepts there as well. So if we have our button component again, so that we were working with before, I can still swap out text as though I was working with variants as well here too. So, right, like, so show me some kittens. And we hit play. We're gonna see here that we get the override preserved even in our hover states as well. Again, this is kind of what you'd expect from how the variant overrides work, but you're gonna see it here in the prototyping capability as well too. So we didn't have to, even if I had swapped my variant normally like this, right? As far as changing what the initial state is, you're going to see that it preserves it there, but it also was preserved in the hover state, and I didn't need to set that up ahead of time. It was just how the override was working. One thing to note on the overrides that's kind of important is if you want to have things preserved in states other than the initial state, they have to exist in the initial state. And if that's confusing, I'm going to explain it and show it right now. So what I mean by that is here we have a tooltip, right? A tooltip has two states. We have one where the tooltip is closed and one where the tooltip is open. If I were to bring this component onto our page right now, this is an instance of that. And chances are I'm going to want to change the text of the tooltip, right? So what I can do is I can go to our open state and I can edit the text here, Here's a kitten. If I decide to set this back to the main component, to the initial state to actually be set to the closed version of the variant, you need to ensure that that tooltip still exists in here. So you'll actually notice that inside of this component, we actually have that tooltip also hidden here. And this is because you're going to need that same thing to exist in both states for those overrides to be preserved. So just know that if you're changing things that aren't the initial state, you're going to want to make sure that that tooltip is there. So in this case, I have it hidden. And now when I go to actually use that component, in this case, I think I hid too much on this one. There we go. Let's unhide that. There we go. Awesome. And I say if we go and actually hook this one up, okay, great. It's got a while hovering event. And you'll see now that I actually get that custom text, that override that shows up. So you can continue to use overrides there. Yeah, little. Yeah. I know, right? It's mind blowing. It's great stuff. Last thing that I'm going to show, and we're going to continue building up in sort of our more advanced features here that we have as well, is understanding different frame sizes. So we're going to build on that tooltip example that we were just looking at a second ago. And you may have noticed something there, which was that the frame size is only around the actual information icon itself. In fact, the tooltip is outside of our frame. It's still in the frame itself, but it's visually outside of it. In fact, we have clipping turned off right now to show how that works. There's a great help article on help.figma.com that talks about clipping and how this can actually be used. But what's happening here is that these are actually outside of the frame size. This is really important when you want to decide how things should be positioned when you're changing from one state to another. By default, things will only change from the top left-hand corner, meaning that you're going to have to construct your frames in a way that they actually appear where they should. So in this case, you can see I've actually manually positioned this tooltip up above the frame where I wanted it to go, and the frame itself is actually much smaller than this as well. So we're able to use a while hovering interaction here. So I'm going to drag between the two. I'm going to say while hovering. So basically, while hovering the size of this frame, I want it to show the tooltip. Again, when I hover outside of this frame, I want the tooltip to go away. I don't actually want the tooltip to stay there, even if I'm hovering over the tooltip. So we make the frame just the size of the button. And what this allows for, and actually, I'll just grab a new example just to make sure. Awesome. Let's go ahead and play that. Oh, I might have accidentally deleted my connection when I did that. Let's go ahead and grab that again. Awesome. Ah. Hold on a second. Let me just double check here. While hovering, change to open. Awesome. How did I break this? I think I know how. I think I grabbed a frame, not the actual instance itself. There we go. Awesome. So you see that that's how we get the while hovering behavior. But if I hover off of the eye, we actually lose the tooltip and it doesn't stay up when it's hovered. You might want a different type of scenario, which is that you actually want the thing that you're hovering over to stay visible when you're outside of it. And this is where having different size frames is actually valuable, right? So in this case, we actually have a menu where we want to show a drop down and we want that to actually be selectable. So you'll see that the frames inside of my menu are actually different sizes, right? So these variants are not the same size as each other. They're going to swap out, and the frame's going to increase in size. So we're going to want to make sure that the menu can actually stay visible when we do it. If we were to just use a while hovering event, so I'm going to connect these two together. I'm going to say while hovering. If we do this, we're probably not going to see the behavior that we want for this example. In fact, let's go ahead and play it. Great, but you can see here, it's kind of acting like the tooltip, right? As soon as I take my mouse off of the first frame, the menu goes away and we can't select it. And that's because the while hovering is looking at the size of this first frame and saying, okay, as long as you're hovering over that, I'll show it. In this case, what we actually want to do is have a little bit more complicated of an event here. We're going to actually use a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So we're going to say mouse enter, and then we're going to say mouse leave. What this does is this then tells Figma to say, oh, okay, yeah, while I'm hovering over something this size, go to this one. And then as long as we're within the frame of this one, until we leave that, then go back to the original over here. So if we look at this version of it, you'll see now that menu will actually stay open. And again, we have those nested overrides, those nested interactive components happening for hover states. So you can see how quickly it is, how quick it is to build a simple menu like this. And in fact, this was only three components for just for the hover state for the button, the menu item overlay, and the actual menu opening and closing as well. Very cool. And with that, I'm going to pass it over back to Miggy for some more advanced examples too as well.
All right. Can you see my frame? Is my frame in frame? We're good. Awesome. Thank you, Nico. Appreciate it. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about component memory, or I like to call frame remembering. For me, that helps me understand the concept a little bit better. So I have here, I'm going to deconstruct this a little bit. So I have two frames. So here's one of my interactive components, right? So when I click on one of these, it changes to this. And when I click on this, it goes back, right? So red dot to yellow dot. And then over here, I have a second different frame. And between these two, right, this will hop over to this frame and this will hop over to this frame. The interaction that I'm using here is navigate to, and I'm doing a push animation. So I'm going to go from one frame to the next. And what I'm going to demonstrate is how interactive components are going to, each frame is going to remember the interactions that you performed. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. So I'm on frame one and I click, 1, 2, 3, and I have those little circles, those little dooders going. And I go now to my next frame and I turn on and I make some other ones, available. So now when I go back to that first frame, that frame still remembers the actions that I performed. So like the different kind of points in time is kind of still there. So I'm kind of going between those frames and it's keeping that. So think of that as, the frame will remember, the interactive component, the actions that you took and kind of where they're at that point, and that stage in their life. That is component memory. And for me, that's, might be a little bit difficult to comprehend. As you start to kind of make, multi-frame prototypes, you're going to start to see the benefit of having that kind of work in that way. So next is the thing that I'm most excited about is I've been seeing a lot of people using interactive components for animation. So I'm going to play this really quick and I'm going to keep it on the screen. I saw that I was maybe going a little bit too fast with some of these prototypes. So I'm going to hit Z so y'all can kind of soak that in, right? Before, when you would go from frame to frame, it would be really hard to have kind of multiple animated things taking place at the same time. So what I'm doing here is I have multiple of these interactive components placed onto this frame, all behaving kind of like going to their own tune and their own timings. So the way that this is broken down, if you take a look at this prototype, I'm basically rotating this internal ball here, right? And if I go to my prototype, did I just break it? No, I didn't break it. Okay, so I'm using the after delay and smart animate to go from one point to the next. I know that some of you are thinking like, oh my God, why is he using linear? If you have something that's a constant motion, like linear is okay, right? It's like the one time that it's okay if you have a constant motion. So what I'm doing is I'm actually rotating these. And the fun thing here that I'm kind of doing is I'm actually rotating it from 0 to 179.9 and then from 179.9 to negative 0.5, right? So I could get that full rotation. But what I have here is I have multiple instances of this on my frame. So I bring this over. Let's go ahead. It has like a little white background, but I can remove that little white background. There we go. So I have multiple of these on and I'm performing my little override. So I'm changing that color and I'm rotating it here. And down here, I have a few other ones. And these are just basically, you know, circles that are kind of bouncing, and each one is bouncing to its own timing, right? So this one is going 600 milliseconds between the frames. This middle bounce here is going 300 milliseconds between the frames. The small bounce is going 150 milliseconds between the frames. So having those instances on that frame, I could even change, you know, that starting frame. So right now I have position ground. I'm going to change that to sky. So once again, when I go ahead and hit play, right, you can see all the things kind of taking place. And the reason that this is kind of awesome is if you're designing a homepage and you want to have little micro animations kind of playing, if you have loading sequences, things like that, there's so much potential and opportunity for you to kind of have these small nested animations that'll just really make your prototype that much more rich. So the last thing I just wanted to identify is just kind of talking back to the way that the engineers were thinking about this, you know, not just creating hover states, but really rethinking and kind of reshaping the way that you prototype in general. You know, we have these sort of ideas and these mantras in the way that this is created. So being able to quickly look at the prototype, you know, at the state of the interactions, and so you can kind of instantly kind of consume what's taking place. So then that way you can iterate much more quickly and produce these outputs. And it's going to make prototyping in general less intimidating because you don't have to create an individual frame for everything. You can make these smaller, more nested interactions that take place. So you're going to have much more opportunity. So we like to say it's, you know, beyond just design systems, right? So variants provided a lot of opportunity for design systems, but interactive components is going to provide a lot of opportunity for prototyping, for exploration, and really kind of digging into the potential of what can be accomplished and allowing you to just get your thoughts out, you know, right there in the stage, hand it off to somebody else, and they can begin to instantly see how something is composed. So we're not going between, you know, like two different pages to see, oh, okay, here's a nested component. Now let me come back to my main stage. It's all laid out there right in front of you. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Anthony, who's going to talk a little bit about what people in the community have been doing thus far with interactive components.
Yeah, and just a couple of points on the stuff that you showed there too. I think that the the easing animations ones. I think I learned this from you, right? When in doubt, ease in and out. That's tends to be good. Yes, linear for when you're doing things where you have to meet, but yeah, at the same time, ease in and out is a lifesaver for sure. On your last point there too, I think Nico had actually mentioned this to me, and Nico, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to this too, but like, you will begin to have a sea change in how your giant prototypes are set up, right? Something that used to maybe be a continuous flow, as in like you're seeing something that moves from one frame to the next, to the next, to the next. And maybe you even have duplicates because you're trying to go back, but you could never really go back in the same way that you wanted to, that kind of thing. You're going to begin to realize that the prototype itself can actually sort of take on a much more compartmentalized or modular structure, right, as you're building those out. So as Miggy was saying there, I don't know if anyone had anything else to add to that, because I know that it was a huge consideration for when everyone was building the feature, right?
Yeah, I can add something to there. We have an internal channel on Slack called Pasta Pictures, and yeah, it's like a known secret, right? We talked about this a bunch of time, and like Pasta Pictures is basically just collecting either internal wild prototypes or kind of like prototypes that people shared, where you just see a lot of our blue noodles flying around on the canvas. And of course, that's not ideal, and we know that people do this. And so for us, I think the way we look at these things is kind of like, what is the set of frames that are necessary to have, so that you can still kind of like read the prototype and understand what it's supposed to be doing, and you can still kind of like easily edit each important part, but that you don't go into like this wild mess essentially. And at the same time, it was super important for us that you can, with minimal context switching, see how the one like interactive component then is used in a different context, and then maybe that interactive component is used in a bigger context. So I think that we'll move away from seeing like these huge pasta messes to seeing like, yeah, a set of compartmentalized like interactive objects that are then reused. And I think you'll be able to see that like through screenshots on Twitter, that you'll start to read these systems in a way of like, oh yeah, this is happening, this is happening. Oh, I understand the prototype just by looking at it once. And I think the more we can get into that environment in which you can like read those really quickly, the more effective it will allow people to collaborate on those prototypes. Because if I jump in and see Miggy's file with the tic-tac-toe, and from the first time I read his prototype, I can duplicate it and iterate it and add my own ideas to this. And I think that readability is huge in communicating how this feature works and communicating your interaction design intent. And so I'm pretty excited to where this will go. But I think we'll have to say goodbye to pasta pictures at some point.
Well, yeah, we'll have more tasteful noodles now moving forward. So one of the last big areas that we wanted to do was a little bit of a community spotlight. This feature has been out in beta for a week now, I want to say, and already the community has created some amazing stuff. Yeah, Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to just maybe like sort of draw attention to what we've been seeing and things like that, or.
Oh yeah, we knew people were going to make some cool stuff when we first built this feature, but I think the quality and variety of what we've seen has just blown us away. I think the first thing that I wanted to highlight, Anthony, if you want to screen share, is something from Adam P., who is a pretty prolific creator in our community. He's been creating stuff since the Smart Animate days, and I think one really popular prototype of his has been a keyboard prototype. And when Interactive Components first came out last week, he didn't disappoint. After 3 days, he came out with this awesome battleship prototype. Yeah, we were joking after Miggy came out with his tic-tac-toe prototype that like, oh, people are gonna make some like pretty cool games now. But after 3 days, just like seeing this where you can play the entire game Battleship in Figma just blew us away.
So cool, yeah. And Adam, if you're out there, definitely publish that as a community file. We want the link. We want to see how it's put together. So.
Oh yeah, just to add on top of that, there were a couple hiccups with publishing prototypes with interactive components in them in the community. They didn't work earlier. They should work now.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're having trouble seeing the interactivity in the prototyping view, you should be able to see that now. So. Yeah, next I'm gonna kick it over to Jamie. I know you wanted to show off something pretty cool that we saw.
Yeah. So I was really impressed when I saw this. This is a Sudoku prototype by Dave Williams. I think that one of the things that I didn't really anticipate is the variety of different input methods people would figure out how to really fruitfully use. So using this Sudoku prototype, I had like a kind of a magical moment, because when I clicked onto it, I'm like, I was wondering kind of what input mechanisms they're using. For other games, we'd seen really cool things like when you click on a square, it would kind of bring up an overlay menu for each of the different options you might choose. So that's what I was expecting. I was expecting to click in and then see all the numbers from 1 to 9. And that didn't happen. And then I was like, oh, I wonder how this works. And then I did the next intuitive thing, which is hitting the number key, the corresponding number key. And when that just worked, my head just kind of exploded. I was just like so impressed that someone had thought through how to use these constructs to build this like pretty realistic input mechanism for a Sudoku game. And I just thought it was so cool to see the variety of different input strategies people have figured out in order to leverage interactive components to make these really rich experiences.
Yeah, this one is wild in particular. So you can see here how this is sort of constructed, right? So there's here's the key gamepad interactions, and this is for every single square, all done compartmentalized into a single square. So again, if we did the math on this, I imagine that if you had to do that in the old-fashioned way, so while we do still have a nice tiny little pasta here going on, but it's like 9 connections, 1 to each of the keys, we would have had to do that times the entire size of the board. I know Nico has done some math on some of these in the past, and the order of magnitudes get up there pretty quickly. So you can see the kind of stuff that we're able to do much more simply than needing to do all of those connections normally. Awesome. Miggy, I know you had another cool one to show off. So this is by Dave Williams. I hope I'm saying that right, Williams. And actually, Dave has another really, really cool one that we're going to show off right now, too. So,
all right.
Take it away, Miggy.
Yeah, so he made Minesweeper, like fully working, too. So, well, fully working, but let's see. So with Minesweeper, let me load this up. And so, yeah, I can basically click. Oops, I think I broke something.
Maybe give it a refresh. I think I hit that
same
bug too. Yep.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, cool. So we can click and basically play Minesweeper. And oops, I hit the bomb. If I want to see all the bombs, there are my bombs. Even has the rudimentary timer. I can hit the R key to restart. I think something's funky with my Zoom. Let me just hit restart.
Happy to show it on my end too, if you want.
All right, so here we go. So click, 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 click. But the really cool thing about this, right? So I hit the bomb, boom, bombs go. The really cool thing that I like about this is, once again, it's like we can easily kind of see, the construction here. He's using the key gamepad when you press the space bar to put the flag on the objects. There's a ton of like after delays here to kind of simulate the timer, but I really like the creative use of the scripter plugin. So if I go over here and I open up the script, let's, oops, did not mean to do that, undo. Okay, so if I click on the scripter plugin, there's a little overlay here, the Mines overlay, oh, here we go. There we go. So you could basically generate, here we go. So I can generate new minefields using the scripter plugin. So this was just like, so not only, really awesome use of interactive components here and kind of generating everything and the interactions, but if you actually have the community file, you can hit play and then regenerate those minefields and kind of keep it covered away from yourself. So if you want to be surprised every single time.
Amazing. I am in the chat, total madness. And it's amazing just like what you can do with this kind of stuff, right? Like, it's almost like we're building little state machines. And this is really pushing the feature boundaries, right? Like, so we know there's going to be really practical use cases, I think, for people doing interface design, but you start to see just where you can take this stuff and just the kind of stuff that can be prototyped all inside Figma. Going to show off a few more here as well, too. I've got a couple examples that I wanted to show. Close a couple of these and let's take a look at the one of my favorites here is a comparison slider. So this is actually done by Andre, I think it's Lenku, hope I'm saying that right. Actually, this is a creator of one of my favorite plugins too, called Styler. So if you want to check that one out, it's pretty awesome. Let's go ahead and play this. And you'll see here, this is actually using drag interaction types to store this as a component. So I can basically click and drag and actually do sort of a preview comparison. So here we're actually looking at saturation comparison between the images, but you can kind of see how this could be used for different ideas in the future, right? So again, prototyping drag interactions, but we've compartmentalized this into a tool so that it's much easier to, inside of a component, so that it's much easier to use. So you can see here are the assets that are getting used for this, and then here's the components. It's just a slider component, and then the actual handle component itself too, right? So we've got the increase in size, and then we've also got the sort of how the drag interaction is happening here. You'll see that if we go to prototyping mode, we have those drag on drag. And the way that drag and smart animate work together is that you can actually, the distance that you drag will actually relate to that particular part of the tweened animation between the two of them. So you can actually manually drag that as well. Pretty cool. Another one, this is by Bruno, one of our actually Friends of Figma Portugal organizers as well. Going back to some of just those simple animation things that we were looking at, this is a great example of how you can just take a quick little micro animation, something like that, and store it as part of your component, right? So you've got these nice examples. Let's zoom out a little bit. And we want to look at another character here as well. So you can see that if we look at how this is actually put together, these are all just stored as smaller subsets and smaller animations, and using those timing delays to really make it a nice, simple experience. So you almost have your little components here that you put together to create a larger animation. Each one of those have their own like mini timelines in that sense, just by how many delays they have, how long the transitions are. Pretty awesome stuff. And then one more. This was actually a remix, I think, that someone did. So there was an original file by Izzy where it had these awesome keyboard keys, basically all of these keyboard keys that are set up for you automatically. This is a community file that's out there. And I believe this was remixed by, oh, shoot, man, I'm going to forget it now. I will have to make sure that I tweet it out to the person who remixed this. Kapoor. Oh man. All right. I'll have to come back to that one. Sorry, I forgot this one in particular. But what's really cool about it is if we hit play, this is hooked up to all the key gamepad interactions as well. So I basically have a full keyboard that I can type on, and I can actually get the keys to highlight. You can start to see some of the, again, more of that compartmentalized interaction where I didn't have to wire this up on some massive scale. I can do it key by key and then reuse those by setting overrides for the letters and things like that. So just a nice, simple way to organize those components. And then I'm going to give it to Nico for, I think, our last and probably wildest thing that we've seen so far. So Nico, you want to explain what's going on here?
I would explain what's going on. I actually don't really know what's going on. But I think, so somebody here like recreated the Figma UI as a prototype in like a Mac OS, I think 91 style. I'm not 100% sure. And it's interesting because it's like it combines a bunch of existing features that we have. It combines auto layout, it combines variants, and now uses interactive components too. I'm not entirely sure how this is set up under the hood. But the interesting thing for me really here in this example is that like, and the thing that I'm also like just super excited to see over the last week, essentially, since this is in beta, is that now with interactive components, we hope that this is the first step to make prototyping not feel like a tedious task, but that it feels like a task that you start in, and then it kind of like you explore, you playfully really explore the interactive possibilities of your interface ideas, right? So instead of being like, oh shit, I have to prototype now, and you create 30 different frames, I really hope that this will kind of like shift towards just encouraging you to try out interactive behavior, and yeah, just play with it, right? And then see, and through expressing your interactive ideas, like improving them and finding better solutions for your product.
Awesome. Yeah. And Wesley, thank you for throwing this together again. Publish this to the community. I'm sure everyone would love to understand how this is built and put together as well. Figma, built in Figma as a Figma prototype that also has the ability to prototype. Inception, we've reached it. Awesome, very cool. Last thing that we want to do is also just give a little bit of time for some questions. I know we've had some good questions that are coming in, so I might actually ask different people from the team to help with some answers on some of these as well. One of the big ones that I think some people have run into is that they've noticed so far that with auto layout and smart animate and there might be some edges there that are still sort of getting figured out. Yeah, I don't know if somebody wants to sort of explain where we're at with that and what's going on in the beta. Maybe I'll pass it off to Andrew if you want to sort of mention. I think we're working on through some of those additional things as well.
Oh, yes. Auto layout is a highly requested feature. It isn't fully supported at the moment, but we are working on it. Sorry, Anthony. Can you repeat the question? I was looking
no worries.
At the Q&A.
That was it. So basically just like letting everyone know that like we know that there's some edge cases in auto layout that you may not look correctly in the prototype right now. Again, feel free to drop us feedback. That's one that we are fully aware of and development is still happening. So cool. Had another question come in just around, do we get access to this document that we're seeing right now? One thing I'll mention is that all of the examples that we've looked at so far, these are actually all available in the playground file. So we actually use the exact same examples for that reason, so that you would actually have access to it. So if you go and you grab the playground file, which you can get at figma.com/@figmabeta would be the beta profile account. And you'll have access to this file where all of these examples exist as well. Here's one maybe for the team. Actually, this looks like the same question. I think it's just mainly around auto layout. Yeah, so if you're seeing stuff with auto layout, just check it out as well. Awesome. Just going through my list of questions that we have over here as well. I know we are getting close on time too, so I just want to check this out. Oh, here's one for the product team as well. Any thoughts on adding any kind of logic? Might we have the idea of logic built in at some point?
Yeah, I can talk about this.
Yeah.
This is like, I mean, I can't promise anything, but generally it's definitely something that we're looking into, not specifically like conditional logic. There's many different ways on how to approach this, but it's basically kind of like how can we make components communicate to each other is definitely on our mind, and that like if some change happens, other components can react to this, but there's no timelines.
That's awesome. Very cool. And got a couple of people asking, how will this work with code export? I'll just take that one quickly there and just mention that we will be looking into ways in the future, but for now, just understand that the inspect panel is going to work as it does with variants, right? So that this is mainly just for inspecting the editor views and less on the prototyping side. So the interactivity you'll see in the prototyping view, but the inspect panel will continue to show things like variant props and whatnot as you're working through them. Great, very cool. We do have another question here. I think this is a good one for us to touch on. Is like, are there any community creations that you can spotlight made by women or others? And I think absolutely yes. And I apologize, I don't have any examples with me today. Please tweet at Figma or at me. I would love to make sure that we get some of those to the surface and that we have more examples that we can show from the entire community as well. Okay, we have a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we are coming up on time for the session today here as well. I might just have a couple more questions, and then any other questions that we didn't get to, again, please tweet at us. We will be happy to answer as much as we can. This is kind of a good one, I think, for the product team and Eng. Are there plans to add more interactions beyond change to? And in my head, I'm trying to think what kind of things that could even be as well, right? Maybe other types of nested interactions and whatnot. Jamie, any thoughts?
Each kind of interaction type that we add to Figma really to make sure it composes with everything else. So I'm sure there's other things we're going to consider in the future, but we don't have any specific plans at the moment.
Awesome, very cool. This is an interesting one. Is there a reason why this is, I think, maybe just for Miggy and I here, why we're using Chrome instead of the app on Mac. Good question. I'll give my answer. It's actually just personal preference for me. It's the same experience in both. I have both. I use the desktop app when I'm developing plugins, but I actually use Chrome profiles pretty heavily. So I actually have multiple accounts that I'm always switching between, and it just makes it really easy for me to not have to sign in and sign out of all of my Google spaces and whatnot. And I have the same thing set up for Figma use cases as well. So personal preference. I don't know if anyone else has an opinion on that one.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm using the Chrome profiles for the same. I just have like so many different approaches and different setups for each one. And I usually use my desktop one for like doing demos, things like that. So I have it set up and like I have things like kind of queued up a particular way there. So I just have just different environments. So just sharing in a live stream is just easier for me in Chrome.
Awesome. Had another question just around, and again, maybe back to the team. Is there any way to affect the state or the current variant of another component? Can you actually have one that changes another one?
That's not possible at the moment. At the moment, the workaround for that is that you kind of like still create two separate frames. So if you need reactions where one object changes and another one changes, you can just kind of like add the interaction onto the interactive component, link to a different frame, duplicate that, and just have the responding changes there. It's the current workaround.
Awesome, very cool. Okay, and with that, I know that there's more questions coming in. Again, there are so many of you. Please come and find us afterwards, and we will be happy to answer more questions. Just a couple closing points that I just want to touch on as we're going through this here. Again, if you're not in the beta yet and you want to be a part of it, please sign up. We will get you in. There is a support forum for anyone who has questions. Great place to ask questions and also get help too as well. Check out the playground file if you haven't already. All of the examples that we walked through today are available in that file, minus the community ones. But again, many of those are in the community. So if you just search interactive components under the community tab, you're going to find a bunch of great examples there. And also always check out the Help Center for more information if you have questions. Couple of just sort of housekeeping things here. Tomorrow, Miggy's actually going to be leading a session with a couple of people from the EDU space, and you should definitely check that out. It's going to be a ton of fun, and you can go ahead and sign up on figma.com/events for that as well. And with that, I just want to give a huge thank you to Product and Eng for joining us today. It's always great having other faces on here with us. And Miggy, who I believe this is one of your first office hours live streams that you've done too as well. And of course, as always, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We can take this feature to a certain level, but we really built here is something for you to explore and actually create things that even we didn't anticipate and understand. And so always be publishing to the community, sharing your ideas out with us. We want to learn more and see more from you as well. And thank you again for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
See everyone.